Now we're interviewing Professor Noam Chomsky, Professor Emeritus in Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT, one of the most cited sources in history. Of course, among his many famous books is Manufacturing Consent. Professor Chomsky, great to have you on the Young Turks. Thank you.
Glad to be with you again.
Is Obama a progressive?
Well, the way the term is used, I suppose the answer is more or less yes, but if so, it's a component of the word progressive. I mean, he's basically, he's what it would have been called several decades ago a moderate Republican, kind of a mainstream centrist with some concerns for liberal ideals and conceptions, but not much in the way of principle or commitment. And on some issues, he's pretty reactionary. Civil liberties, for example.
When I was growing up, if Ronald Reagan had used drones or any other kind of bombs to execute U.S. citizens abroad without a trial, I imagine that there would have been a tremendous uproar. So isn't he in some ways much further right than even Republicans were a couple of decades ago? And then what does that tell us about our current political environment?
Well, that's why I said he's kind of what used to be a moderate Republican. Moderate Republicans have more or less disappeared. The Republican Party is overwhelmingly so extreme that it's hardly a traditional political party anymore. And the mainstream Democrats have become pretty much what used to be called moderate Republicans. I think you're right that if Reagan had been carrying out a global assassination campaign, there might have been a hue and cry, but not much. Take a look at what Reagan was doing. Okay, so this morning, for example, it was reported that in Guatemala, a General Rios Montt, is being brought to trial, to everyone's surprise. He's being brought to trial for crimes that he committed in the early 1980s under Reagan. The Guatemalan army under his command was committing a virtual genocide in the Guatemalan highlands among the Mayans. Meanwhile, Reagan was praising him as a good man, a man totally dedicated to democracy. He's getting a bum rap from the human rights organizations who accuse him of various things, but basically a good person. We got to keep supporting him. Go back and try to find out how much protest there was. There was some. There was a solidarity movement, which was significant and important and courageous. In fact, in many ways, it opened new paths in opposition to state violence. But by and large, protest over the atrocities and Guatemala was only one example, were pretty slight.
We talked about earlier here that the system seems to have shifted even more right, so the Democratic Party has now become the moderate Republican Party. What do you think is the main underlying reason for that shift? Why is that shift even further right happening? It's
a reflection of the redesign of the economy since the 1970s. From the 1970s, for all kinds of reasons, there was a real reshaping of the economy. And the design is correct. There were alternative policies. These are the ones that were taken. There were two major elements of it. One was a shift towards financialization. You go back to before the 1980s. Banks, there weren't even many interstate banks. Banking was mostly a local phenomenon. Banks were what banks are supposed to be in a state capitalist system. They take your deposits and lend them to somebody who wants to buy a car, or send his kid to college, or start a business, or whatever it may be. That's what a bank was, and they operated essentially locally. Starting in the 1970s, particularly since the 1980s, they began to grow enormously. By the time you get to the latest crash, 2007, financial institutions were making about 40% of corporate profits. Well, at the same time, manufacturing, this is a related development, manufacturing was moving towards offshoring. So you have these two tendencies getting started, and they have consequences. The one consequence was a very sharp concentration of wealth. It's not a big secret that since then, wealth in the United States has concentrated enormously. Along with concentration of wealth leads very quickly to concentration of political power. I mean, by now it's so obvious you can't even debate it, but it's always been true that money was a major factor, if not the major factor, in winning an election. By now it's so dramatic that we hardly have to talk about it. The last election was, just for president, was over $2 billion, which is unheard of. Well, as campaigns are increasingly bought, the political figures become more and more, have to climb deeper and deeper into the pockets of those who are funding them. So as the political system gets shredded, wealth gets concentrated, other policies change accordingly, you get a natural drift of the parties to the right.
Do you think we're ever going to get to that point where we have gotten beyond those pathologies and get to a state that in your writings you would prefer? Do you think we're ever going to get there, or is the human nature and the greed involved in it too strong and will always block it?
Well, I think we've, in many ways made a lot of progress towards getting there. Not in this particular domain. Here there's regression. But mutual aid, mutual support, solidarity, concern for others, these are parts of human nature. And very often they've been realized in very successful ways. So like take, say, the labor movement. One reason why the business world and elite elements in general are so anti-labor is that those are precisely the values that the labor movement sponsored at its best, not at its worst when it was run by, mafia gangsters and so on. But at its best, it was based on conceptions of solidarity and mutual support and even international solidarity. Now, that's why the unions are called internationals. Now, you can talk about all the limitations in trying to achieve those objectives, but that's what lies behind it. And that's what lies behind the successes of the labor movement, which were quite real, like the New Deal legislation. So it's not beyond human nature. It's a part of our capacities in many respects. We've moved forward in these dimensions, in other respects not, sometimes backwards, but I don't see any reason to think that, if you look at the trajectory over the past couple of centuries, I think it's been basically towards progress, towards expanding the domain of rights and justice.
Professor Chomsky, great
Okay.
conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks. Really deeply appreciate it.
Good to talk to you. Bye.